India's massive gamble on Russian oil was once hailed as a masterstroke of economic strategy. After the war in Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions imposed by the West, Russia became desperate to find new buyers for its vast reserves of crude oil. India, with its ever-growing appetite for energy and its need to keep fuel prices low for its 1.4 billion citizens, saw an opportunity. Moscow offered steep discounts, sometimes as much as $30 to $40 below the global benchmark, and New Delhi jumped at the chance. Tankers full of Russian oil began docking at Indian ports, refineries ran day and night, and for a while, India appeared to have outmaneuvered the world. While Europe struggled with rising energy bills and inflation, India was securing cheap fuel, saving billions, and positioning itself as a shrewd player in the global energy game. But beneath the surface, this was never a risk-free move. India's dependence on Russian crude tied its energy future to a nation under siege, a nation whose very economic survival depended on evading U.S. sanctions. And in 2025, that gamble has begun to unravel. The United States, determined to choke off every possible lifeline to Vladimir Putin's war machine, has launched the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. These sanctions do not just target Russia directly, they strike at every company, every bank, every shipowner, and every government that dares to keep the flow of Russian oil alive. For India, this is a nightmare scenario. What once looked like a brilliant deal has now become a dangerous liability. The root of the problem lies in the very structure of global trade. Oil, no matter where it is drilled or who buys it, is overwhelmingly priced and transacted in US dollars. The dollar is not just a currency, it is the backbone of the global financial system. Every tanker shipment, every insurance policy, every letter of credit that makes oil trade possible runs through channels controlled, directly or indirectly, by Washington. This is the silent architecture of American power. A refinery in Gujarat might buy oil from Russia, but the payments, the shipping insurance, the trade financing, all of it is exposed to U.S. influence. And this is where America's strength lies. While Russia can pump crude, and India can refine it, only the United States controls the arteries through which the global oil trade flows. For a time, India tried to outmaneuver this system. Payments were routed through obscure banks. Settlements were attempted in rupees, in dirhams, even in barter-like arrangements where Russia would accept goods instead of cash. Shadow fleets of aging tankers were deployed, their transponders switched off, sneaking shipments through the high seas. On paper, it looked as if New Delhi was successfully balancing its need for cheap energy with Washington's expectations. But as the U.S. tightened the noose in 2025, the costs of this strategy are becoming unbearable. Shipments are now routinely delayed because insurers, under threat of U.S. penalties, refuse to cover Russian cargoes. Tankers that once slipped through are being tracked by advanced satellite surveillance and intercepted through coordinated efforts with European allies. Payments routed outside the dollar system are piling up, with Russian banks increasingly unable to convert them into usable hard currency. Every step India takes to bypass sanctions is being countered by new layers of American pressure. The once profitable discounts on Russian oil are shrinking as the costs of evasion rise. What was once a winning bet is rapidly turning into a trap. And yet, the U.S. has not directly punished India, not yet. Washington knows the value of New Delhi as a strategic partner, particularly as tensions with China continue to rise. But America's approach has always been the same: pressure, leverage, and dominance without direct confrontation. Officials in Washington speak warmly of shared democratic values and strategic alignment, but behind closed doors, every conversation comes with subtle reminders. Access to U.S. technology, military hardware, and global markets is tied to compliance. India may feel independent when it buys Russian oil, but the more it leans on Moscow, the more vulnerable it becomes to American retaliation. And this is no accident, it is a deliberate strategy. Russia, meanwhile, is not in a position of strength. Sanctions have crippled its economy. Energy revenues, once the lifeblood of the Kremlin, are dwindling. The European market, which for decades bought the bulk of Russian oil and gas, is gone. China drives hard bargains, exploiting Moscow's desperation to demand even deeper discounts. That leaves India as one of Russia's last major customers. On the surface, this gives New Delhi leverage. But in reality, it places India in a dangerous position. It is now tied to a partner whose power is fading, while risking the anger of the superpower that still controls the world economy. This contrast, Russia's decline versus America's dominance, is at the heart of why India's gamble is backfiring. The United States is not just an oil producer, it is now one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas, a dominant force in shale oil, and a country with unmatched financial tools. Washington does not need to block every tanker or sanction every company. All it needs to do is remind the world that access to its financial system is conditional. And no country, not even India, can afford to be cut off from the dollar. Already, the effects are visible. Indian banks are growing hesitant to process payments for Russian oil. Refiners that once boasted about record profits from discounted crude are now complaining about shrinking margins. The rupee settlement schemes have not scaled as expected, leaving billions locked in limbo. Shipping companies are demanding higher fees to carry sanctioned cargo, erasing much of the discount advantage. Even worse, whispers in Washington suggest that if India continues down this path, its access to U.S. defense technology and trade deals could be quietly slowed or restricted. For New Delhi, which dreams of becoming a global power, such outcomes are unthinkable. And this is exactly why U.S. dominance remains unchallenged. America does not need to shout, it does not need to send warships or threaten open retaliation. Its strength is woven into the very architecture of global commerce. The dollar, the banks, the insurance giants, the trade networks, all bend to Washington's will. Even allies and adversaries who resent this dominance find themselves complying, because the alternative is economic suffocation. India's leaders know this. Behind the rhetoric of strategic autonomy lies the sobering reality that New Delhi's long-term growth, its technological ambitions, and its defense modernization all depend on access to the West. Russia can provide oil, but it cannot provide the future. America can. And that simple truth makes every barrel of discounted Russian crude more dangerous than it appears. Yet the temptation remains. India still sees value in cheap Russian oil, and Moscow still needs New Delhi as a buyer. But the cost of defiance is rising by the day. What began as a profitable arrangement is now a risky gamble that could cost India far more than it ever saved. And Washington, patient but relentless, is watching closely. By early 2025, the effects of U.S. sanctions are no longer subtle, they are overwhelming. What once looked like minor inconveniences for India's oil traders have now grown into systemic obstacles. Shipments that used to take weeks are now delayed for months. Payment channels that seemed secure are abruptly cut off when banks, fearful of U.S. retaliation, pull back. Even neutral middlemen, companies in Dubai, Singapore, or Hong Kong, are finding it too risky to touch Russian cargoes linked to India. Every step of the supply chain is being choked, not by force, but by the sheer gravity of America's financial power. Washington has made it clear that this is not just about Russia, it is about reasserting control over the global order. For decades, the US dollar has been the undisputed reserve currency of the world, and every attempt to bypass it has failed. Europe's experiment with autonomy collapsed after the Ukraine war when its energy dependence on Russia backfired. China has tried to promote the yuan in trade, but trust and convertibility remain limited. India's rupee trade schemes have floundered, trapped in the hard reality that only the dollar has the liquidity, the trust, and the reach to bind global markets together. And now, in 2025, America is proving once again that it alone sets the rules. In New Delhi, the government faces a difficult balancing act. Publicly, officials insist that India is pursuing a path of strategic independence, refusing to bow to pressure from either Washington or Moscow. They remind the world that India is the fastest-growing major economy, a rising power in its own right, and cannot be dictated to by outside forces. But behind the scenes, the anxiety is clear. Meetings with U.S. diplomats are becoming more frequent, more tense. Every purchase of Russian oil is scrutinized, every transaction carries the risk of exposure. India's refiners are privately lobbying the government to scale back, warning that their profits are being eaten away by sanctions compliance costs. The very gamble that once seemed like a golden ticket is now turning into quicksand. Russia, too, feels the squeeze. Desperate to keep its oil flowing, Moscow is offering even steeper discounts to India. But cheap oil is no longer the solution it once was. With shipping, insurance, and financing costs soaring under sanctions pressure, those discounts barely make a difference. In some cases, Indian refiners are finding that importing from Russia is no longer cheaper than buying from the Middle East or even the US itself. The very foundation of the gamble, economic advantage, is beginning to collapse. Meanwhile, the United States is playing a longer, smarter game. Instead of confronting India directly, Washington is applying pressure through the system itself. American banks tighten compliance. European partners coordinate new sanction lists. Global insurers quietly withdraw coverage for tankers linked to Russian trade. None of these moves are announced with fanfare, but all are deeply effective. India is left with shrinking room to maneuver, while the US maintains its posture as a friendly partner rather than an adversary. This is the essence of American dominance: control without confrontation, power without spectacle. The irony is that India's dependence on Russian oil was never about energy security alone, it was also about asserting independence from Western pressure. For decades, New Delhi has prided itself on maintaining ties with Moscow, dating back to the Cold War when the Soviet Union was one of India's closest allies. Russian weapons, Russian technology, Russian political support, these were pillars of India's rise. But the world of 2025 is no longer the Cold War. Russia is weaker, isolated, and increasingly dependent on its few remaining partners. America, meanwhile, is stronger than ever, with allies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia looking to Washington for leadership. The very partnership India leaned on is now a liability. This is where the reality of power becomes undeniable. Russia can sell oil, but it cannot guarantee safe passage through global waters. It cannot provide the financial architecture to move billions in transactions. It cannot replace the Western technologies that India desperately needs for its economy, from semiconductors to defense systems. Only the US and its allies can provide these. And America knows it. Every meeting, every negotiation, every subtle diplomatic warning is a reminder that India's long-term future depends far more on its ties to Washington than on any deal with Moscow. The consequences of this reality are beginning to show. In the energy markets, India is quietly reducing its Russian imports, shifting back toward Middle Eastern suppliers. The discounts that once seemed irresistible no longer justify the risks. At the same time, US energy exports are rising. American LNG is flowing into Asian markets, US oil is finding new buyers across the world, and Washington is positioning itself not just as the policeman of global energy but as one of its most important suppliers. The world that once relied on Russia is now tilting toward America. For Russia, the picture is grim. Every barrel of oil it fails to sell cuts deeper into its already fragile economy. The Kremlin had hoped that countries like India would provide a lifeline, but that lifeline is fraying. With China squeezing Russia for better deals and India struggling under US pressure, Moscow finds itself running out of options. The very strategy that was meant to outlast Western sanctions is collapsing under the weight of American power. For India, the gamble has become a cautionary tale. What began as an attempt to secure cheap energy has turned into a lesson in the limits of autonomy. No matter how large or ambitious, no country can ignore the structures of global power built and maintained by the United States. The dollar system, the financial networks, the trade routes, all of them reflect American influence. And when Washington decides to act, even giants like India are forced to reconsider their choices. This does not mean India is retreating completely from Russia. Old habits and old partnerships do not disappear overnight. But the trajectory is clear. The more the US tightens its grip, the more India recalibrates its strategy. The gamble that once promised billions in savings now threatens billions in losses. And in the game of global dominance, it is always the US that writes the final rules. By the end of 2025, the story of India's Russian oil gamble is no longer one of bold strategy, it is one of quiet retreat. Tankers that once carried discounted crude are fewer. Deals that once bypassed the dollar are now stalled. The dream of outmaneuvering the system has been crushed by the reality of American dominance. Russia is weaker, India is chastened, and the world is reminded once again of where true power resides. Because in the end, this was never just about oil. It was about control. And in a world where energy, finance, and technology decide the future, the United States still holds the commanding heights. Others may gamble, others may resist, but the outcome remains the same. The US sets the terms, and the rest of the world plays by them. India's gamble backfired not because it lacked ambition, but because it underestimated the simple truth that defines the modern era. When America decides to close a door, no one else can open it.